Syria, 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 Mabrook, Allah Jalla Mabrook ya Syria, Allah Jalla Mabrook ya Syria, Allah Jalla Mabrook ya Syria, Mabrook ya Syria, Allah Jalla Mabrook, Allah Jalla Mabrook ya Syria.
Sednaya Prison, located north of Damascus, is one of the most infamous and feared prisons in Syria, and perhaps the world. Over decades, it became associated with human rights violations, especially during the Syrian war. The prison transformed into a symbol of fear and oppression, surrounded by horrifying reports that became public after certain phases of the conflict ended. Life inside the prison was akin to death. The cells were designed to hold a limited number of detainees, but soon became overcrowded to an alarming extent. A single cell, meant for a small group, often held double or triple its capacity. Imagine being confined in a narrow space where you couldn't move, forced to sleep crammed on the cold floor, or taking turns to lie down because of the lack of space. This overcrowding was only the beginning of endless suffering. Prisoners faced catastrophic health conditions as diseases spread quickly due to poor hygiene and the complete absence of medical care. Common illnesses such as scabies and tuberculosis thrived in these environments. Starvation was a deliberate tool used to weaken and control the prisoners. The food provided was barely enough to keep them alive, often contaminated or of very poor quality, leading to cases of food poisoning and chronic illnesses. Survivors described eating scraps or searching for anything edible on the ground. Deep within the prison lay the most horrifying places, torture chambers. These rooms were specifically designed to inflict maximum physical and psychological pain. Survivors spoke of tools like electric chairs, iron whips, and metal rods. Common methods included electrocution, hanging prisoners by their limbs for hours or days, and brutal beatings that often resulted in death. But physical torture wasn't the only weapon of control. Psychological torment was ever present. Prisoners were completely isolated from the outside world. They were not allowed to see their families or communicate with them, and had no idea about their fate or how long they would remain in this hell. Each day carried the constant fear that it might be their last. Executions were carried out in secret. Prisoners were often transported at night to unknown locations within the prison, where they were executed, usually by hanging or gunfire. Survivors confirmed that these executions were conducted without fair trials, and the main goal was to eliminate large numbers of detainees as quickly as possible. What made these events even more horrifying were the discoveries around the prison. Human rights reports revealed mass graves nearby, containing the remains of thousands of prisoners who were executed or died under torture. These graves served as physical evidence of the atrocities committed behind the prison's walls. Although few survived, those who did manage to escape told their stories. One survivor said, "Death was present in every corner. We saw it in our eyes and felt it in our bodies." Others spoke of being forced to watch their fellow prisoners being tortured or killed before their very eyes, leaving deep psychological scars even after their release. Mazen Hamada was one of the prominent Syrian activists and a political activist at the beginning of the Syrian Revolution in 2011. He was born in Syria and participated in peaceful protests against the Syrian regime at the onset of the revolution, demanding freedom and democracy. Mazen was in his 20s when he started participating in demonstrations in his city. He was an ambitious and educated young man who fought for human rights. In early 2012, during the peak of the protests in Damascus and Homs, he was arrested by the Syrian security forces during a raid on his home. He was taken to Sednaya Prison, one of the worst prisons in Syria. Mazen Hamada was held under harsh conditions where he was subjected to systematic torture in the prison. In Sednaya Prison, he endured continuous beatings, electric shocks, and deprivation of food and water for long periods. He was also forced to stand for long hours in cramped, unbearable cells. Later, Mazen learned that many of the detainees in the prison had been executed or forcibly disappeared. The conditions in the prison were hellish, with prisoners enduring various forms of physical and psychological torture. After more than a year of detention, and as a result of prisoner exchange deals or political decisions, Mazen was released. However, he emerged from prison physically emaciated and emotionally scarred. Despite the suffering he went through, Mazen decided to share his story with the world, to expose the horrors that took place behind the walls of Sednaya Prison and document the violations he endured. Over time, Mazen had to leave Syria to escape the regime that was pursuing him. He managed to reach European countries where he continued his work in the field of human rights. Mazen Hamada later became part of many organizations working to document human rights violations in Syria. He participated in numerous international forums, sharing his story of imprisonment and torture. His testimonies became a powerful tool for exposing the Syrian regime's practices of repressing opposition. He became an example of courage, overcoming adversity, and a symbol for survivors of oppressive regimes in Syria. Mazen Hamada, after surviving Sednaya Prison and enduring horrific torture, continued his work in defending human rights and exposing the violations occurring in Syria. After fleeing Syria and settling in Europe, he became a prominent figure in documenting war crimes and the violations suffered by the Syrian people. He participated in international conferences and forums, emphasizing the necessity of prosecuting those responsible for these crimes. Later in his life, Mazen decided to return to Syria after years of exile. His motivation was his desire to be part of the change in his country and to help rebuild Syria after years of war and destruction. However, the return was fraught with danger, as the Syrian regime continued to pursue opponents and exiles. In 2018, while Mazen was on his way to carry out humanitarian missions inside Syria, he was kidnapped by Syrian intelligence. His disappearance was documented under mysterious circumstances, with all communication with him being cut off. Later, reports emerged stating that Mazen Hamada had died under torture in one of the detention centers controlled by the Syrian regime. His death sparked a wave of anger and sorrow among Syrian activists, who saw it as yet another symbol of sacrifice in the pursuit of freedom and justice. Mazen had lived his life fighting for human rights and justice, and his death served as a confirmation of the extent of the oppression still faced by the Syrian people, even years after the beginning of the revolution. Despite his death, Mazen Hamada's legacy lives on in the field of human rights. His story and testimonies about torture and violations in Sednaya Prison and other Syrian prisons are among the most influential in the human rights arena. Mazen became a symbol of resistance, not only against the Syrian regime, but against all forms of oppression and injustice in the world. Sednaya Prison represents a dark chapter in Syria's history and embodies the horrors endured by detainees for many years. These painful details underscore the urgent need to document the crimes that occurred within this place and hold those responsible accountable, not only to achieve justice, but also to ensure such events never happen again.